Oh, wait. Okay, so how should I do chapter by chapter? You want me to just go? Hi, I'm Morihiko Nakahara, the music director of the South Carolina Philharmonic, and we are excited to open our 2021-22 concert season with a concert called Mendelssohn's Scottish Symphony. So in a way, it is sort of a family celebration for us to open this season and welcome all of you into our musical home here at the Koger Center, in person, or if you're joining us virtually through the live stream, we welcome you again for another season of live stream concerts as well. As I mentioned, the centerpiece of the evening, which you'll hear after the intermission of the concert, is the Third Symphony by Felix Mendelssohn, a German early Romantic composer. He was also a gifted conductor as well. He actually was, both him and actually his older sister, Fanny Mendelssohn, were responsible really for bringing to attention the works of Johann Sebastian Bach. It's kind of hard to imagine it these days because composers of the past, like Bach, Mozart, their works are so popular and so established and become such a standard part of our repertoire, whether we're orchestras or chamber ensembles or soloists. But that wasn't necessarily the case in the early 19th century. A lot of the works by Bach were actually sort of forgotten and not performed anymore. But it was Felix Mendelssohn who worked as a conductor in Leipzig with the Gewandhaus Orchestra, which actually the orchestra still exists to today. Mendelssohn was actually one time a music director of this orchestra, and he programmed works by the past masters like Johann Sebastian Bach or Mozart, and sort of allowed the contemporary audiences of his day to hear the works of the past masters. And that's the standard practice now, but that wasn't necessarily the case back then. And we sort of owe this to people like Berlioz and Mendelssohn for bringing this practice of programming the works of the past and incorporating it into the present, which is sort of what we do with our orchestras today. Mendelssohn was as much of a prodigy as Mozart was. Especially as a composer. In his teen years, he had already written a standard part of our repertoire today. For instance, the overture to his setting of Midsummer Night's Dream by Shakespeare was written in his teen years, as well as a piece, the octet for strings, which is such a monumental work. After his teenage years were done, he had turned 20, and his father, who was a well-established banker in Berlin at this time, he told Felix to sort of go explore the world. So he went on what people call the Grand Tour of Europe. It was a multi-year trip, and he traveled all over Europe, the musical capitals of Europe at the time, and getting to know personally the foremost composers, performers, artists, writers. London have become one of his favorite places. But early on in his London excursion, he specifically wanted to go to Scotland. But the hope was Mendelssohn, along with a good buddy of his, spent about 6 weeks in Scotland, sometimes on foot, kind of hiking around various locations in Scotland. They had a close call on a ship, kind of ran into some storm there, which actually you can hear in the first movement of the Scottish Symphony. It's quite a vivid depiction of the rough seas and then the rocky waves and so on. But they went in hopes that he would actually meet Sir Scott as well. Mendelssohn, whenever he traveled, he took a sketchbook with him. If you go online, you can actually find Mendelssohn's paintings and drawings. He was actually also a gifted painter as well. I mean, what couldn't he do? So this was when he was about 20 years old. He, at this point, had an idea to write a symphony based on his impressions of this trip. actually took him about 10 years to finish up this work. But partially, I think, because he was making all these drawings as well, and I'm sure he had quite a vivid memory as well. So he was able to kind of come back to this idea of writing a symphony in 4 movements based on his impressions of his journey throughout Scotland. You might notice that at the beginning of the symphony, it has a very, I would say, unique color. And the reason for that is that the violins are not playing at all. It's the whole opening for the first few seconds of the symphony features the woodwinds. The violas have the huge theme and the lower strings. And it's quite a striking effect when the violins actually finally come in with the soulful melody. But he got the idea for this opening, apparently, upon visiting this castle where Mary Queen of Scots lived. He had the idea to he had this vivid sort of imagination of seeing in the sort of the ruins of the rooms where all of these historical events happened, and sort of had an idea for this very soulful opening for this projected symphony based on the Scottish journeys. Then it moves into a fast section. Aforementioned sort of this rocky sea journey, sort of the stormy, stormy ocean and the rocky ride and sort of kind of scary experience. Apparently it was. The second movement is a very lively dance that features a lot of the woodwind solos, clarinet in particular. Some people hear in this particular movement, in the second movement, and throughout the symphony, because the symphony is called Scottish, and we know that he was inspired to write this symphony based on his journeys through Scotland, people kind of maybe sometimes read into it maybe a little deeply and assume that he quoted some sounds of folk music or folk dance that he heard during his journey. And incidentally, Mendelssohn was very clear that all of the materials were his original and he wasn't quoting any folk dances. He actually went almost the completely opposite direction and said he didn't quite enjoy the folk dances and the Scottish folk songs. He admitted that the actual quote was the Scottish folk songs actually gave him a toothache. And I don't know how truthful that is, but it was sort of his point, trying to make a point saying, well, this is my sort of impressions of the landscapes and people and the sights and sounds of Scotland, not the actual quotations of it. Somewhat similar to what Beethoven did with the Pastoral Symphony, his Symphony No. 6. Well, should I just pick it up, or do you want me to restart the Vivaldi? Right. Okay. So many of you are probably familiar with the name Antonio Vivaldi from his famous Four Seasons, which is a series of 4 concertos, of course, for solo violin, depicting each of the 4 seasons, and that's rightfully has become a classic, one of the most famous and iconic pieces in our repertoire. He wrote so many other pieces, including the piece we're going to play for you on this particular program, and that is the concerto for 4 violins and orchestra. So there are 4 solo violins, and there's an important solo part for the cello as well. And these musicians are sort of set against the backdrop of a string orchestra and harpsichord. To play these solo parts, we are featuring 4 of our own musicians. So we have Marilee Taylor-Kinosian, who is our concertmaster, Ashley Horvat, who is our associate concertmaster. So she's the one who typically sits next to Marilee when you come to our concerts. And Damir Horvat, same last name as Ashley because they're married to each other. And Damir Horvat has been the principal second violinist of the South Carolina Philharmonic. I think he actually started the year I started in 2008 in that position. And Sophie Wan, who is our senior assistant concertmaster. So she sits behind Marilee when you come to our concerts. And so these 4 leaders, really, of the violin section in our orchestra, they are going to be taking the solo turn. I think one of the most enjoyable thing as a listener for this piece is the contrast of the four violins, sort of each taking and making these musical dialogues, sometimes using the same musical material, or sometimes they're sort of going in each in their separate directions a little bit, and having that one dynamic of four soloists, and then the dynamic between those four soloists with the entire ensemble. So in a sense, it becomes sort of a musical like call and response sometimes. So maybe one of the soloists will initiate a musical idea, a conversation, if you would, and it might be the idea then might be reinforced and answered by the entire group of the violins and so on. So it's one of those. There's a lot of conversations and dialogues and tossing of the ideas back and forth happening. And when you have four soloists, especially in the last movement, it almost becomes kind of like a kaleidoscope of all these ideas that become just kind of hard to keep track because they get tossed around so quickly from one another. But it's such a fun piece to do, and it's always fun to do these pieces with our own musicians taking the solo spotlight. There's another piece by Italian composer, and for this one, we actually go even further back in time to Renaissance era, actually. And the Renaissance era Italy was where a lot of what we know now as sort of instrumental music and instrumental ensemble music sort of really came into its own. Renaissance Italy, especially in Venice, was sort of this whole notion of instrumental ensemble music really came into its own. And, of course, the instruments were sort of precursors of what we know and hear today. But, this is sort of the early form of what we know as orchestra or instrumental ensembles really originated. And for this, we turn to Andrea Gabrielli. Now, those of you who are out there who might be fans of Canadian brass or brass ensemble music, probably familiar with the name Giovanni Gabrielli, who wrote all of these antiphonal pieces for multiple choirs of instruments. And Andrea Gabrielli was actually Giovanni Gabrielli's uncle, and probably was not as well known as a composer as his nephew. His nephew Giovanni Gabrielli is, he's a famous composer. You will definitely find his name in a music history textbook, if you would, of all the important composers, especially of the Renaissance era. Andrea Gabrielli became a music director, sort of the chief organist, if you would, of the famous St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice. And this is where he was able to explore this idea of writing works for various choirs of instruments, and using the amazing space that was the St. Mark's Cathedral. They would often place one choir in one part of the cathedral, and they will play antiphonally, sort of, again, the idea of call and response. But the second choir will be spaced far apart from the first choir. So you can hear sort of this call and response coming from different parts of the building. And oftentimes Gabrielli would write these pieces, but without really specifying what instruments should play which part. What's beautiful about that is that we could perform these pieces using instruments that are available to us and cover all the parts. So what we are doing is we're doing a piece by Andrea Gabrielli, probably his most famous surviving work, which is called Aria della Battaglia, or a battle song, would be the translation in English for this. And for this one, we're using two choirs. One choir on one side of the stage, where you see 8 of our woodwind players. The opposing chorus, and not the battaglia, the battle. It's not really battle of, it's not like a battle of the bands or anything. It's not like these two are like battling against each other. So, but we have one is the woodwind ensemble of 8 musicians. And on the opposing side, we have 8 brass players who will form the second group, second choir, instrumental choir. And the piece starts out with just the woodwind choir starting with this music, and it will be answered by the brass choir on the other side of the stage, and eventually they will start to play together, as it will happen in the second part of this piece. And it's one of those fun pieces that are not done often. There's a modern version of transcription, if you would, of this that we could use with our modern day orchestra that was done recently by Mark Scatterday, who teaches at Eastman School of Music. So that's the version we are doing. To open the concert, we are featuring a piece that is getting a lot more performances, especially these last few years. And it's one of the rare pieces written for orchestra that survived by Fanny Mendelssohn. Fanny Mendelssohn Hansel was her full name. And Fanny was Felix Mendelssohn's older sister by 5 years. And she was known throughout her life as an equally talented composer and pianist and conductor as her brother Felix Mendelssohn. So they received the same training when they were growing up. From early on, the 2 older siblings, so the Fanny Mendelssohn and Felix Mendelssohn, show the talent and interest in music. So their parents right away hooked them up with lessons and in piano and composition and so on to try to really foster those talents. And so in the case of Fanny Mendelssohn, she ended up writing, I think, close to like 500 works. Most of those works were either for solo piano or what we call art songs. So these are written for solo voice, based on the most often German text in her instance with piano accompaniment. And a lot of these pieces were performed in what we would, I guess today we call these house concerts. So these house concerts were made famous by composers like Franz Schubert around the same time. So especially in the 1830s, 1840s, and so on, there would be sort of an informal gathering of friends, family, and friends in somebody's home. And there would be a sort of an intimate evening of chamber music, solo pieces for piano, maybe like something like piano trio or string quartets, and things like art songs. And so these things became really a huge driving force for creativity. And this is where music lovers would go, obviously, to hear these, performances, but so would poets and visual artists and playwrights and all the people from all different walks of life who come together in these house concerts to share and listen to new music. And Fanny Mendelssohn really became a huge influence and huge presence on the salon music scene. And we believe it was for one of these concerts that she wrote the piece you're going to hear tonight, which is Overture in C major. It dates from 1831. And incidentally, so that's right around the time or right after Felix Mendelssohn's trip to Scotland. So that was in 1829 into 1830 or so. So it's around the same time. We know that from Fanny Mendelssohn's letters to her brother, that it was first performed in a house concert, and a few years later, it was performed again at another house concert in which she conducted the performance herself, because there was a letter from Fanny to Felix Mendelssohn in which she talks about how nervous she was about sort of, in a way, putting herself out there as a conductor. And especially a piece that she had written, but previously, like 2 or 3 years ago, and sort of coming back to it. So she felt she was a little bit maybe anxious and nervous about this whole experience. But then she talked excitedly about how the musicians played well, and everybody loved the piece, and she was very happy and sort of felt fulfilled after this particular performance. So we know those performances happened, but then it was never published. This piece. Until late 90s, 1990s, that is, or early 90s. In early 90s, there was a group called the Women's Philharmonic in the Bay Area in San Francisco. Joanne Falletta was one of the music directors of that group at the time, and they found the manuscript to this piece and finally was able to get it published. So thanks to their advocacy and their tireless work, orchestras around the world can now, and audiences around the world can perform and enjoy this brilliant piece by Fanny Mendelssohn. It is unfortunate that we think of people like Fanny Mendelssohn Hansel, Clara Schumann, who was married to Robert Schumann, few of these other female composers from the 19th century. It's interesting to note that there aren't a lot of large-scale orchestral works by these composers. In the case of Clara Schumann, perhaps her best-known orchestral work is the piano concerto, her piano concerto. One would often think why that is. And it goes back to sort of what I mentioned about how Fanny Mendelssohn Hansel's, her creative outlet, where she could perform as a composer and performer, was limited more to these house concerts and salon concerts. So naturally, a lot of their works were written for either solo instruments or small ensembles. Had they been given the opportunities to showcase their talent, writing operas or writing symphonies, our concert stage and what we can program probably have were different. But that's sort of the reality, unfortunately, of composers from these past centuries. As a matter of fact, Fanny Mendelssohn's father was very adamant that she not pursue a career as a composer. And so it took a lot of negotiating, so to speak, sort of across the dinner table at their home while she was growing up, that she really wanted to do this. It was something that she wanted to do and was passionate about, and obviously was very talented. There's such beautiful lyricism in the opening of this section that if you enjoy this particular piece by Fanny Mendelssohn, I would encourage you to go check out some of her other works, perhaps some of her art songs for solo voice and piano, or some of her solo piano music. So it's kind of a good way for us to kind of bookend this concert with musical siblings, Fanny Mendelssohn Hansel and Felix Mendelssohn. And also, but in the middle feature, so there's a musical family, the musical siblings of the Mendelssohn family. And in the middle, we are also sort of highlighting the various family members of our orchestra, be it the four violin soloists of the Vivaldi concerto, or the woodwinds and the brass sections in the Andrea Gabrielli work. So it's really sort of a homecoming in a way for us, and it's our way of saying, these are our musical family members. And where we play here at the Koger Center, this is really our musical home. So it's great to welcome all of you back into our musical home to enjoy these concerts live in person. And if you're out there joining us via the live stream, I hope you can get a glimpse of our family life here at the South Carolina Philharmonic, and hope you can tune in for our future concerts throughout the season as well. Done.